They found the bones first. Not laid out with any care, not buried deep, but scattered beneath a floor that had been replaced too many times to remember what it was hiding. Small bones, too small. Some burned black at the ends, others gnawed smooth, as if even the earth had tried to erase them. When the boards came up, a breath escaped the hollow itself, warm, sour, alive, carrying the memory of screams that had never reached another human ear. The smell was not only rot, it was old milk, old blood, and something sweeter, like decay that had learned patience. The cabin stood where maps stopped naming things, trees pressed close, their roots buckling the stone foundation as if trying to pull the structure back into the soil that had birthed it. Inside, ash stained the walls in hand-shaped smears, carvings marked the beams, dates that repeated, names that returned again and again, written by different hands but spelling the same blood. There were marks low on the walls where something had scratched to get out. There were stains beneath the hearth where fires had burned too hot, too often, fed with more than wood. The men who found it would later say the silence was the worst part. No birds, no insects. Even their own breath sounded wrong, as if the air resisted being disturbed. They stood ankle-deep in history's refuse, realizing they had stepped into a place where family had turned inward and begun to eat itself, slowly, lovingly, generation by generation. This is not a story that begins with discovery. Discovery only happens after the damage is complete. Before we go any further, pause with me for a moment. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Wherever you are, whatever hour has found you, understand that what follows did not stay buried because it was unreal. It stayed buried because it was too real to carry back into the light. In the years after the war, when the rest of the country spoke in the language of rebuilding and progress, there were places that never heard those words. Hollows where the same surnames echoed for a century. Valleys where children learned their family trees by memorizing circles instead of branches. On yellowed county maps, these places were often left blank, as if the cartographers themselves chose mercy over accuracy. The hollow where this cabin stood had a name once. It was spoken softly, then not at all. People in the nearest town crossed themselves when storms rolled in from that direction. Dogs refused to track game there. Hunters claimed they heard singing at night, thin, wrong voices that sounded both young and impossibly old, harmonizing in ways that made the skin tighten. No one went looking. No one wanted to know what kind of life could survive so long without witnesses. But something had been born there, something that grew up without mirrors, without comparison, without the knowledge that it was wrong. And when it began to leave marks, on animals, on the land, on its own blood, the hollow held its breath and let the story rot inward, waiting for someone else to find it. The hollow sat folded between ridges like a clenched fist, invisible from any road that mattered. Old survey records from the late 19th century mentioned it only once, as a boundary marker rather than a destination. Beyond that, it vanished from paper. No census taker ever reached it, no school district claimed it. Church routes curved deliberately around it, as if faith itself knew where it would not be welcomed. Those who lived nearest spoke of it in the past tense even while it still existed. They said a family had settled there after the Civil War, drawn by land so cheap it might as well have been cursed. The soil was thin but workable. The forest was thick enough to hide a multitude of sins. Isolation was not an accident. It was the point. The first cabin was raised with green timber and stubborn hands. A man and a woman, cousins, some said. Others said brother and sister, though no one could ever prove it. In those years, record-keeping was a luxury, and shame traveled faster than ink. What mattered was that they stayed. When neighbors drifted down to towns, married out or died, this family remained, tightening inward as the world widened elsewhere. By the time the 20th century arrived, the hollow had learned a rhythm. Births happened quietly, deaths happened quicker, graves were shallow. And close to the house, marked with stones instead of names. Children grew without ever seeing another child who did not share their face in some distorted way. Their features echoed each other, eyes set wrong, jaws heavy, limbs bent like branches after ice. The child at the center of this story was born during a winter so harsh even the creek froze solid. The mother labored alone, biting into leather to keep from screaming. No doctor came, no midwife dared. When the crying finally started, it sounded wrong, too deep, too steady, as if the lungs inside that small chest already knew endurance. They wrapped the child in rags cut from dresses that had belonged to women long dead. No one marked the date. Time in the hollow did not move forward. It circled. The child grew fast, bones hard but misaligned, head slightly too large for the neck that held it. By 3, it watched instead of played. By 5, it spoke in sentences that seemed borrowed from older mouths. It asked questions no one had taught it to ask. Animals avoided the yard. Chickens stopped laying. A goat was found with its throat opened cleanly, organs arranged carefully beside it. No one punished the child. No one taught it otherwise. Discipline requires an idea of normal, and normal had died generations earlier. At night, light flickered from the cabin long after everyone should have slept. Shapes moved against the curtains, too many, overlapping. Sometimes there were voices arguing with each other in the same tone, the same pitch, as if one body were rehearsing an entire family at once. The hollow listened. It always did, and it remembered everything. As the child aged, the hollow seemed to contract around it, as if the land itself were drawing closer to watch. The trees leaned in, paths narrowed. Even the creek altered its course, carving closer to the cabin, whispering through stones like a voice learning a language it had once forgotten. Seasons passed without celebration. Birthdays were not counted. Years were measured by scars. The child learned early that blood meant more than injury. Blood was history. Blood was law. When elders spoke, they spoke in fragments, half verses passed down from mouths that had lost their teeth and clarity together. They warned of leaving, of eyes that judged, of hands that took children away and never returned them. The world beyond the ridges was painted as a place of fire and cages. Better to stay, better to fold inward and endure. Strange habits emerged. The child collected small things at first, feathers, teeth, bits of bone scraped clean by ants. These were arranged beneath the floorboards, lined up with care, as if forming a record that could not be written. Later came drawings, etched into bark and ash, figures with too many joints, mothers with faces split in half, one side young, the other collapsing into age, circles within circles, no branches, no exits. At night, screams carried through the trees. Sometimes they were animal, sometimes they were not. The elders said nothing. Silence had become a kind of prayer. When a neighboring farm's cattle broke loose and wandered too close, they were found days later, bloated and blind, their eyes pressed inward as if pushed by careful fingers. The farmer did not complain. He moved instead. Visitors came once, years earlier, a man from the church and another from the county, riding tired horses, Bibles and forms tucked under their arms. They never reached the cabin. Their horses panicked at the edge of the hollow, rearing and screaming like prey. The men left shaken, telling the town only that some places did not want to be known. The child listened to everything, learned the weight of fear without being taught its name. By adolescence, the body had grown wrong, limbs slightly mismatched, a gait that dragged one side. But the eyes were sharp, too sharp. They watched elders pair off at night, watched how bloodlines braided tighter with each passing year, learned what was expected without it ever being spoken aloud. The first ritual was not called a ritual, it was necessity explained as survival, then tradition, then inevitability, firelight, closed doors, the smell of sweat and old fabric. The child did not resist. Resistance requires the belief that another choice exists. Soon after, a baby cried in the night, then another, seasons later. Some lived, some did not. The ones who died were buried quickly, their names spoken once and never again. The ones who lived ride the same marks, the same narrowing of possibility etched into their bodies before they ever stood upright. The hollow absorbed it all, every sound, every secret, waiting for the moment when the circle would finally collapse under its own weight. The escalation did not announce itself, it never does. It arrived as a quiet change in rhythm, a sense that the nights were growing longer, even when the days said otherwise. The child, no longer a child in body, though never something else in mind, began waking before dawn, standing barefoot in the frost, listening to the hollow breathe. Sometimes it spoke aloud to no one, rehearsing conversations with voices that shared its tone but not its age. Symbols appeared carved into trees along the creek, not words, not letters, shapes that suggested repetition without end, circles scored so deeply the bark bled sap for weeks. The elders pretended not to see them. Pretending had become a survival skill. Animals vanished more frequently. Traps were found sprung but empty, their mechanisms bent as if tested by curious hands. When dogs from neighboring properties followed scents into the trees, they did not return. What came back instead were bones laid in patterns at the edge of the hollow, as if something wanted to demonstrate understanding. The child's offspring grew in number and in strangeness. One spoke fluently at 3, but never learned to walk properly. Another walked early, but never spoke at all, eyes fixed on things no one else could see. At night, the cabin filled with overlapping cries, some infant, some adult, indistinguishable in the dark. The air inside grew thick, damp with breath and sickness. Identity blurred. Names were reused, roles overlapped. A woman would be mother to a child who was also her nephew, her cousin, her mirror. Stories contradicted themselves, then settled into something worse than confusion, acceptance. The family tree no longer made sense drawn outward, so it was memorized inward, each generation pressing closer to the same origin point. Drawings changed. Where once there had been figures, now there were diagrams. Bodies opened, lines connecting organs from one form to another. A single face sketched again and again with minor variations, like attempts to remember a dream that refused to stay still. The child, now elder, now parent, kept these hidden beneath the hearth, along with bones that were no longer small. Screams became rarer, replaced by a low moaning that traveled through the hollow at night, carried by wind that seemed to know where to go. Townspeople heard it and told themselves it was weather, or animals, or memory playing tricks. No one went to look. Then came the night of fire. It started inside the cabin, not as an accident, but as an offering. Too many mouths, too many sick bodies, too much evidence of what had been done. Flames climbed the walls while those who could walk fled into the trees. Those who could not were left where they lay, their cries swallowed by smoke and history. By morning, the cabin was a blackened shell. Bones cracked in the ash. Records burned, names lost. The family scattered deeper into the forest, splitting into smaller units that could hide more easily. The town spoke of it only once, in church, where a prayer was offered for unnamed souls, and then never mentioned again. But fire does not cleanse everything. Some things survive heat, some things wait. The truth surfaced not as a confession, but as a pattern too consistent to ignore. What the town had refused to name, what the church had buried beneath prayer and silence, began to show itself in bodies, in births that arrived wrong, in children who carried the same eyes as their uncles, their fathers, their brothers, in women whose bloodlines doubled back until ancestry and parentage became the same word. The reveal came slowly, like rot working through wood. A midwife, one of the last who still remembered how to keep quiet, noticed that the child she was called to help deliver bore the same crooked jaw as the man waiting outside, though he claimed to be an uncle. Another birth, another repetition, the same deformity appearing where it should not, the same sickness claiming infants before their first winter, the same surnames looping. When the burned cabin was finally approached weeks later, it was not curiosity that drove the men there. It was necessity. Cattle had gone missing, streams ran foul, something had to be done. Beneath the ash, the eye found what fire had spared. Pages fused together, drawings half charred but still legible, a crude family tree scratched into wood, its lines folding back into themselves until the center was thick with repetition. One name written again and again in different hands: mother, sister, wife. The child at the center of it all was no longer singular. It had become a role passed down, a shape the family filled without questioning. Each generation repeated the act, believing it was survival rather than destruction. They had no language for incest, only closeness, only blood. When the truth reached the town, it spread like sickness. People reacted not with shock, but with anger sharpened by shame. They had known enough to look away, now they knew enough to feel complicit. Animals were slaughtered as precaution, dogs shot, outbuildings burned, anything that could carry the taint was destroyed. The family members who remained were driven deeper into the forest, stones and curses thrown after them. The church led the cleansing. Hymns drowned out cries. Bibles were held high while houses were put to the torch. No records were kept of who died that night. No names spoken aloud. The official story became simple: a bad family, a bad place, best forgotten. Years passed. The hollow grew quiet again, but the land did not heal. Hunters avoided it. Trees grew twisted. The creek never quite ran clear. Children born in nearby towns carried small, unexplained defects. Nothing severe enough to investigate, just enough to whisper about. The family line, though fractured, did not vanish. It narrowed, hid, waited. Blood remembers even when people pretend not to. And decades later, someone would come looking, not for salvation, not for punishment, but for understanding. They would open boxes sealed since the 1940s. They would listen to tapes that crackled with breath and regret. And they would realize the fire had come far too late. In the early 1980s, when archives were being reorganized and forgotten files surfaced from basements thick with dust, a researcher stumbled across a box that should not have existed. No catalog number, no proper label. Only a name written in fading pencil, pressed so hard it had scarred the cardboard beneath it. Inside were photographs, negatives stuck together by time, and reels of magnetic tape wrapped in paper that smelled faintly of smoke. The man was not a folklorist. He was a genealogist by training, drawn to the way families replicated themselves across centuries. What he found inside that box disrupted his understanding of lineage entirely. The photographs showed faces that repeated with minor variations, as if a single person had been copied again and again from a damaged original. The same jaw, the same eyes, the same asymmetry. Generations collapsed into one expression. There were field notes written by different hands, but in the same careful tone. Mentions of a hollow without a name, of a family whose relationships could be diagrammed without crossing lines, of children born carrying the weight of decisions made before their grandparents were born. One note referenced a fire, another a forced dispersal. None gave dates precise enough to cross-reference easily, as if accuracy itself had been considered dangerous. The tapes were worse. When played, they revealed interviews recorded on location, the wind moving through trees in the background, the voices strained and uncertain. A woman spoke about her mother teaching her which relatives were safe and which would make the babies wrong. A man laughed when asked about marriage, then stopped abruptly, as if realizing the sound was inappropriate. A child hummed softly throughout an entire recording, never responding to questions, never stopping. The researcher followed the trail back to the mountains. He hiked to where the maps blurred, where the forest felt older than it should have. What he found were ruins barely visible beneath moss and leaf litter. Charred beams, stone foundations sinking back into earth. He collected soil samples, photographed carvings in trees that had partially grown over their scars. He felt watched the entire time, though nothing moved. Back in his office, he began to understand the scope of what he was documenting. This was not a single family's tragedy. It was a demonstration of what isolation does when combined with fear and necessity. Bloodlines fold inward, choice disappears, love becomes indistinguishable. Harm. He wrote his findings carefully, avoiding sensational language, focusing instead on the mechanics of decay. His work circulated quietly among academics, passed hand to hand rather than published widely. Some things, it was agreed, did not belong in public imagination, but knowledge has a way of leaking. And once you understand how a family can become its own prison, it is impossible not to look at other forgotten places and wonder what they are hiding. The hollow still exists. The forest has reclaimed it. But the story did not end with fire or dispersal. It ended with recognition, and the uncomfortable realization that this kind of collapse requires only silence to continue. By the time the researchers' work reached a wider circle, The town closest to the hollow had already learned how to forget twice. Once when the family burned, again when the evidence resurfaced. Old men recognized faces in the photographs and refused to say how. Women who had been children during the fire stopped attending church the weeks the tapes were discussed. Silence returned, thicker for having been disturbed. What unsettled those who read the notes was not the deformity, it was the consistency, the way generation after generation repeated the same decisions, not because they wanted to, but because they could not imagine an alternative. Isolation had not only narrowed their blood, it had narrowed their thoughts. Choice itself had atrophied. The researcher traced marriages in surrounding NG counties and found echoes, surnames that appeared where they should not, birth records amended quietly, infants sent away to relatives who never existed. The hollow had not been an anomaly. It had been the most concentrated example of something spread thin across the mountains, diluted just enough to escape attention. He interviewed social workers who had been active in the region in the late 1940s. One remembered a woman brought into town after the fire, her back bent, her face wrong in a way that made people avert their eyes. She had asked where her children were. No one answered her. She left town before winter and was never recorded again. The tapes revealed another detail the town had buried. The family knew. Not in scientific terms, not with language of genes or inheritance, but in outcomes. They knew which pairings led to sickness. They knew which children would not live. And still they continued, because leaving meant exposure, and exposure meant annihilation of a different kind. They chose a slow, private destruction over a fast, public one. In the late 1980s, the researcher presented his findings to a closed conference. No press, no recordings. When asked what disturbed him most, he did not mention the bones or the incest or the fire. He spoke instead about the drawings, how the same face appeared again and again, subtly altered, as if the family had been trying to remember itself while actively forgetting the outside world. Afterward, several attendees requested copies of the materials. One asked if DNA samples still existed, another wanted to know if the land had been tested. The researcher declined. He had come to believe that some records should remain incomplete. Not to protect the guilty, but to protect the living from turning tragedy into spectacle. Today, the hollow is marked on no tourist map. There is no sign, no plaque. Those who hike near it report a heaviness in the air, a sense of being observed by something patient and tired. Trees grow in uneven rings there. Animals skirt its edges. The family line is gone. But the conditions that created it are not. Isolation, shame, silence. These still exist, waiting for someone else to decide that folding inward is safer than reaching out. In the decades that followed, the hollow became a reference without a name. Researchers spoke of it obliquely, as if direct mention might summon something back into being. Case studies cited a mid-century Appalachian family, and moved quickly past the details, focusing instead on conclusions that felt clinical, distant, safe. But the original materials never lost their weight. Those who handled them described a physical unease, a sense that they were holding more than paper and tape. By the 1990s, advances in genetic science made the story newly relevant. The researcher, now older, was contacted by laboratories interested in historical DNA comparisons. He refused every request. There were no samples left that could be ethically traced, he said. But privately, he admitted something else. The family had not needed modern science to understand what was happening to them. They had lived the consequences directly, carrying them in bone and breath. One journalist, persistent and patient, managed to track down a woman who had been a child in the town during the fire. She agreed to speak on the condition that nothing be recorded. She described the night the sky glowed orange behind the ridges, the way adults spoke in low voices, telling children to stay inside, the smell that lingered for weeks afterward. She remembered seeing a figure at the edge of town days later, watching from the trees, bent, still, waiting for something that never came. The journalist asked if she believed any of them survived. The woman's answer was careful. "Survival's a funny word," she said. Some things keep breathing long after they're already gone. Attempts were made to locate descendants, but the line had ended quietly. No marked graves, no final record, just an absence where a family had once existed. In medical literature, the case became an endpoint, an example of what happens when diversity collapses completely. In local memory, it became a warning told without details. Don't go there, don't ask about that place, don't marry too close, don't keep secrets too long. The hollow itself continued to decay into the landscape. Cabins sank, paths vanished, trees swallowed scars, but certain marks remained visible to those who knew how to look. Carvings half grown over, stones arranged too deliberately to be natural, soil that tested strangely, carrying traces of old fires and long-buried remains. Those who stand there today report the same sensation described decades earlier, not fear exactly, more like recognition, as if the land remembers being used to hide things, as if it understands the cost of being cut off from the rest of the world. The researcher never published a final paper. When asked why, he said the story was already complete. It did not need amplification, it needed restraint. He believed the true lesson was not about deformity or taboo, but about how easily humans convince themselves that isolation is protection, that silence is safety, that keeping everything inside will somehow prevent harm. What remains now is not a family, but a question that never fully leaves the mountains. It surfaces whenever another hollow goes quiet, whenever a road ends too abruptly, whenever a surname repeats too often in a place where no one leaves and no one new arrives. The records, such as they are, sit sealed in climate-controlled rooms, accessed only by those who already understand what they are about to see. Pages warped by moisture, ink pressed hard by hands that knew they were running out of time, voices on tape that hesitate before answering questions they were never supposed to hear. Together, they form a single, unbroken confession, not of guilt, but of inevitability. The child who began this story did not know it was monstrous. The mother, who was also a sister, did not believe she had chosen wrong. Choice implies alternatives, and alternatives require contact. What they had instead was repetition, mistaken for tradition. Love, stripped of distance, turned inward until it became indistinguishable from harm. Generation after generation inherited not just blood, but the consequences of silence. The fire did not end it. The dispersal did not end it. Even extinction did not end it completely. What lingered was understanding, slow and uncomfortable, a recognition that isolation is not neutral. It shapes bodies. It shapes minds. It reshapes morality itself, until acts that would horrify an outside observer feel ordinary, even necessary. Stand at the edge of that hollow long enough and you begin to feel it. Not a presence, but an absence. The missing branches of a family tree that never had the chance to grow outward. The children who were never born because the line could no longer sustain itself. The voices that learned too late that survival without connection is just another form of dying. So here is the final thing the records never state outright, but imply on every page. This did not happen because these people were evil. It happened because they were alone, because fear taught them to close ranks, because shame convinced them that being seen would be worse than what they were doing to themselves. If you discovered tomorrow that your mother was also your sister, that your bloodline had folded in on itself long before you were born, what would you do with that knowledge? Would you run from it, bury it, or would you speak, knowing that exposure hurts but silence destroys slowly and completely? The mountains do not answer that question, they only keep it, waiting for the next family to decide whether to reach outward or disappear inward, leaving nothing behind but bones beneath a floor and a story no one wanted to tell.